Hello, everyone, and welcome to Be the Change podcast. Today, I am proud to welcome a very special guest to the podcast who unfortunately is joining us under very sad and very scary circumstances. Chad Mott has been a teacher at Evergreen High School for 21 years. He has taught a variety of social studies subjects, including world history, US government, and comparative government, and has seen thousands of students come through Evergreen High School, starting as 14-year-old freshmen and leaving as 18-year-old seniors, ready to step into college, the workforce, or other opportunities. Beyond that, Chad Mott is a leader in the Evergreen community, a mentor to so many students, and most importantly, for me, my brother, and my sister, he is an incredible dad who has inspired me to pursue so much of the work that I do today. On the 10th of September at Evergreen High School, 16-year-old Desmond Hawley opened fire on campus with a revolver, ultimately shooting two classmates, one inside and one outside the school, before dying from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Thanks to quick lockdowns, locked doors, heroic acts from students and teachers, and the rapid arrival of police, many more lives were likely saved. As we're recording this on Monday the 15th, both of the injured students remain in the hospital, and classes have been canceled at Evergreen High School for the remainder of the week. This is a very, very hard episode to be recording, and as you might be able to tell, very emotional for me and for my dad. But I think that this is a really important conversation for us to have, Dad. Can you tell me about what September 10th was like for you, as much as you would like to talk about? I'd love for you to share.
Thanks, Love. Thanks for having me. I hope that what we talk about today will be somewhat cathartic and informative, particularly for the people that are familiar with Evergreen. Lots of alumni and lots of community members. I think one of the things that anyone would tell you that was there or has been there for any of these school shootings, every one of these is different, and within each one of these situations, the experience can be incredibly varied depending on where you were and the timing. Some people were inside, outside, lockdown, all different kinds of things. I think the school community responded incredibly well. They well trained, unfortunately, and that's part of the story that we have in your generation is that you have been trained in all of this. You are aware, and the kids and the staff and the police and the first responders, everybody was pretty remarkable in this. I do want to explain to the people listening who are familiar with the high school, when you see, the layout and kind of how this played out right down the middle of Main Street, which is our main hall, our main thoroughfare, and about 10 to 15 minutes into the lunch hour. And to put it very bluntly, it could have been a heck of a lot worse, because this kid, Desmond Holly, who I had in class, and in fact was in class just 10 minutes before, he decided to go into action and open fire on Main Street. He clearly, to me, was not intending to make this, a bloodbath. Had he wanted to make this worse, it would have been a lot worse. And instead, I think he was looking simply to make a point by targeting a couple of different types of individuals that he was aware of, and certainly that's backed up by some of what we've seen in his social media activity. And that this was a kid, unfortunately, that had been, as they say, radicalized, and very anti-Semitic and bigoted towards people of color, people who are different than him, people who are, have differences as far as sexual orientation and everything else. So just understand the layout that this could have been much worse. This could have started, in fact, in my classroom. Had he wanted to inflict, the most damage, it would have been just as lunch was beginning in my classroom, and then it would have spilled out into Main Street, where there would have been, as you know, hundreds and hundreds of people, instead of waiting for 10 or 15 minutes when Main Street had been mainly emptied out. So understand that the terror is real. I think that anybody that goes through this, the one thing that will stay with you, remain with you, is kind of the shock and awe of it, the prevailing feeling in Evergreen and amongst the people that I've spoken with, my colleagues and some students, obviously a lot of outreach, is that sense of kind of shock and vulnerability, deep sadness. But I think the vulnerability, the kind of awareness that in a place like Evergreen, which is normally so safe and so loving and so open, any place is open to this kind of an attack. All it takes is one individual, and I think that's what we really should be focusing on is what are the root causes here. It's not about what happened on September 10th. It's the much bigger picture of how did we get to this point.
Yeah, which I think is why I want to talk with you about this because you are, as we've talked about, probably the person that a lot of the Evergreen High School community, but also the wider Evergreen community, would probably go to talk with about the political forces at play here and why this all happened. So I think if we can channel it into this episode, hopefully it's a good resource for people to understand a little bit more about why this happened and what's going on in Evergreen, but of course across the United States as well. So, as of September 10th, according to Every Town's tracker, which I checked today, but they only updated it September 10th, there have been at least 100 incidents of gunfire on school grounds, resulting in 32 deaths and 98 injuries across the United States in 2025. And there were two shootings on the 10th, one at Evergreen High School and one at Utah Valley University, where Charlie Kirk was assassinated. So, my first question, I think, is how did we get to this point as a country where we are having more than one school shooting in a week, sometimes two in a day, as we saw last week? This has been happening for years. This has been happening for as long as I can remember. As you said, my generation has been trained to deal with situations like this. So I think ever since Columbine, which was before I was born, we've been dealing with this. How did we get here?
I think that can be the first step, is kind of the brief historical arc that we've been on. And I think Columbine is an excellent place to start. But I also think that the late 80s and into the 90s, as far as the media landscape and the political landscape, must also be understood by particularly people who are younger, like you, that you were born after Columbine. Understand, of course, that in the late 80s, we rescinded the fairness doctrine. And what that had done for the previous 40 years is require that any political broadcasting, whether it be radio, television, what have you, needed to be objective or at least balanced. It needed to present both sides. And when cable became ubiquitous and people literally had access by the late 80s to dozens and then eventually hundreds of channels, we decided that it was no longer necessary. And that, of course, unwittingly, what we unleashed were the forces of an incredibly partisan media and partisan divide in the media. And then, of course, into the 2000s, we get into the age of the internet being kind of everywhere and becoming, a major force in the media and information, and then begetting social media in 2003. And so we think about 2003 as a kind of a turning point, a major turning point, and again, allowing for the kind of amplification of messages that was never before possible, and also the anonymity of it all, right? A teenage kid like the shooter in question here, or the young man, the assassin in Utah, they wouldn't have had access to this kind of information previously, right? Everything would have been much more objective. They wouldn't have been able to go down these rabbit holes, these echo chambers, as we call them. They wouldn't have had access to that. This wasn't a possibility until we got into the 2000s. And the problem with that reality is that we all recognize it. Anybody who understands the situation knows that this is happening. When you talk about a kid being radicalized, that's exactly what's happening. And it's very difficult to control by parents. It's difficult to be aware of by anybody except the big tech companies and the big media conglomerates. Most people don't realize that there are really only 5 or 6 kind of major forces here at work in terms of controlling the content. And I think we have to recognize that this has been happening without regulation. We haven't had meaningful action by Congress since the late 1990s, right, 1997, because they simply haven't been able to get ahead of it. They haven't been able to come to kind of any agreement on this. And they're being handsomely rewarded for that lack of effort in terms of campaign donations and funding by the big media conglomerates and by the big tech companies. And so here we are. We're at this point where historically this is the world that we have created. And it's a huge multi-billion-dollar world. You always follow the money in America. And you say, well, how is this happening? Well, because there's billions of dollars to be made. And that includes, of course, unfortunately, people like Charlie Kirk and others who are, capitalizing on fear. Fear is a great commodity, and it's a very, very valuable commodity. And if we use, these platforms to stoke that fear, you can be richly rewarded, and that can be liberals or conservatives alike. And of course, all it does is have the impact of further marginalizing our populace and radicalizing young people. This is something that we need to get ahead of as far as some of our policies, and I'm sure we can talk more about that.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I think giving that historical context to it is really important because there is definitely this sentiment when these events happen. It couldn't happen here, but also you're almost waiting for it to happen because it feels like there's no rhyme or reason to it, which feels like a very strange paradox. It could happen anywhere, but it couldn't happen here. And, I think that that's what everyone's dealing with Evergreen right now.
I think it's even more likely, Lil. I think, it's unique. I think when you know anything about Evergreen, you realize this is a place where we don't even have to lock our doors. We really don't worry
Mhm.
about violent crime. You're more likely to be accosted by an angry bull elk than you are anything else. But in a sense, a high school like Evergreen, because it's so dynamic, because it's so kind of disproportionately dynamic and exciting, and the people are high functioning, that it's much easier then to understand how that typical teenage boy who is already facing enormous pressures. There's not a person, there's not an older person alive who wouldn't tell you that middle school and high school are difficult times where you're questioning your own your own abilities, your own place in the world. You're trying to find that, and if you already feel a bit marginalized, and you're looking around a place like Evergreen High School is an intense place. There are incredibly talented and intelligent people, and if you're feeling marginalized, even at the margins, it's much easier than to be attracted by this kind of radical message to say, well, I need somebody to blame, and I think that that's what's happening with so many of our young men. You guys in the UK, of course, furthered this discussion with that powerful series last year called Adolescence, and I think we're more and more people are looking at that and saying, well, lack of role models, bad messages, radical, and then of course you add to that the scapegoating and the anger, and you add to it the ubiquitous nature of guns in American culture, and it makes sense that of course this could happen and will eventually happen in a place like Evergreen.
I think that leads well to my next question because you mentioned that there could be some ways for people to try to prevent these events before they occur or maybe look for warning signs. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think you're right, where a lot of the rhetoric around this is it's not the guns, right? That's what I've been seeing a lot on social media is it's not the guns that kill people, right? It's the people. So I think there's two pieces of this where gun control, yes, that needs to happen, but also we need to focus on the people and the shooters, unfortunately, in this situation. So, what are some ways that families, teachers, schools, members of the community, how can we actually work to prevent future school shootings? What are warning signs, things to look out for?
Yeah, for me, they're kind of 3 points of the triangle, if you will, and one is guns, and I say, that it's we're not going to get rid of guns in the United States, but we all know that of course most mass shooters, and thankfully not ours in Evergreen, who only had a 38 revolver, that's not gonna we're not gonna go get away from that. We're not going to take away all guns. That's not even part of the debate. Liberals don't want to get rid of guns either. They simply want to mitigate the problem. When we talk about reasonable gun control, right? That's something that when we think about all of our civil liberties, we have reasonable controls on all forms of our liberties. And yet this is one area over the past 30 years where the more radical positions have been winning the argument of saying there shouldn't be any control, which of course leads to mass shooters being able to access military grade weapons, and particularly the AR-15, which is the weapon of choice. I think reasonable gun control is what the overwhelming polling tells us Americans support. So that's one point. But I think the bigger issues, as far as kind of focusing on the individuals, number one, the political rhetoric, of course, is so incredibly divisive right now. And what we heard from the White House on Wednesday and Thursday, of course, was fanning the flames. This is not about unifying. This is about using this to divide and conquer. And again, we have to understand that in the social media landscape and in the podcast world that you operate in, and cable television and everything else, there are billions of dollars to be made in stoking the fear. And again, that fear, okay, is a very, very valuable commodity. So I think we have to look much more deeply at making some kind of reasonable regulations. The Europeans have gotten ahead of us on this, particularly the Germans have gotten ahead of us on this. Content moderation, where you look at this and say, look, is this rhetoric? Are these algorithms, are they creating imminent lawless action? Are they leading us to a point where violence and violent rhetoric, violent conduct, and actual violence and school shootings becomes inevitable and more likely? Well, in any other part of our law, we would then regulate that to a reasonable level. And I think that that's something that Congress has failed us, and I think that's where people need to speak up and really just demand change in that regard. And then, of course, the third thing beyond the political division, we think about that social media landscape and we say, this is something that we have to look very hard, not only at the content and not only at what we're going to be okay with. I think in Europe, most Americans don't realize, but in Europe, they follow a standard that I think is kind of more responsible, and that is an extreme negligence standard, where you say, look, it's not okay to lie. It's not okay to defame. It's not okay to spread conspiracy theories, which are completely false. This is not about censoring one side or the other. It's about simply kind of moving the barriers to a more reasonable level. We would never allow, school teachers or anyone else to speak to teenagers the way that, with the kind of information and misinformation that they can get on social media. So you look at a country like Australia, and they've created a 16-year-old limit for social media. I think we are far beyond the obvious need to have some kind of reasonable regulation. And that's where people can get involved. It's simply time that we have to demand action, from our leaders. We have to rail in the big media conglomerates. We have to rail in, okay, the gun companies. We have to rail in the social media companies. There's just too much money being made. If we go back, and I hate to pull the political science, historical reference, Lil, but when we were forming all of this, the Constitution, and we were talking about the liberty of free expression and the liberty of free assembly politically, we realized why that was so important politically. Okay, as far as a democracy, we must be able to protect that marketplace of ideals. But James Madison also cautioned us. He said, "Look, it's important to have those freedoms." He said, "But," and I'll quote, he said, "ambition must be made to counteract ambition," which means we must speak up. And I think we are so shocked right now as a people. We feel so hopeless and so helpless that maybe we have to hit rock bottom, and maybe that's what's coming in the aftermath of the Charlie Kirk assassination. But it's time for everybody to get off the deck and say, look, the pendulum has swung way too far, to kind of authoritarian fear mongering, and we have to fight back. And we have the ability to do that. And it's time to take these kind of moments and how we're feeling and put them into action.
That's really, really powerful. And you mentioned the Charlie Kirk assassination. In your opinion, do you think that that's a step forward or a step backward? Because I think it might be a little bit too early to really tell. But I think what concerns me is that it's just creating further divisions between people based on the liberal response to it and the perceived liberal response to it by conservatives. And I think that the media narrative is getting very confused and very muddled around what's happening. What's your take? I guess you can't really speculate too much. It is only a week out, but what do you think?
I think in the short term, I do fear that there's going to be a lot of retribution. There certainly could be some more high profile targets, particularly liberals, but we've seen that over the past 10 years, right? We've had kidnapping attempts. We've had, bombing attempts at the Biden house and at the Obama house. We've had, all different kinds of physical attacks of the governors and Governor Shapiro and Governor Whitmer and others. But I think in the long term, we're also starting to see, and I keep my eye out for your generation, Lil. That's where I find my hope. I see some young talented new politicians who are stepping forward on both sides and are saying, look, enough is enough. We've gotten, this is not no longer a partisan issue. This is an issue of trying to preserve our democracy. This is an issue of trying to stick with the American ideals of liberty, equality, and self-government. We will not be forced into kind of the fear that can lead you into an authoritarian regime. I think way too many people are against that. But right now, it is kind of James Madison's worst nightmare that we have, one small, relatively radical minority who's controlling all branches of government. And I think most Americans, are realizing that. I think for some Americans, it'll take the shock of some of this kind of violence, the actual and rhetorical violence. But for a lot of Americans, let's be honest, we really don't make serious change. We don't get up off the mat and take action until our pocketbooks are hurt. Right? You have to follow the money, and I think that we're going to have to see that this model and this direction that we're in is not only dangerous to our democracy, not only dangerous to our ideals, but also it's just bad economically. That's what gets most Americans' attention. If gas prices go up 50 cents, and the farmers are hurting, that's the kind of thing that makes most people pay attention. Unfortunately, in America, it's always about follow the money. But that does give me hope that somewhere soon there will be, this inertia against this direction, and that we'll stand up together, to preserve what has always made us great and made us the longest, serving, longest, form of democracy and longest a commitment to a constitution in world history.
I want to take it back down to that local level and to the family unit. You mentioned adolescence, which is a great place to start. As a parent, what is your take on how parents can support their kids when it comes to existing in the digital world that we have now? Is it asking questions? Is it trying to be on it yourselves? I know that we've had lots of conversations about this, but as you sit here, being in a situation where obviously a young person was radicalized in Evergreen, oh, those are our dogs, everyone who's listening. But as you sit here now, what is your take on the role that parents and families can play in preventing some of this as well?
Well, I think, I do. I've always felt sympathy for parents as a parent. I know how difficult it is to hold down, jobs and lives and do all that you need to do on a daily basis, and then still try to watch over what your kids are doing on social media. I think, a couple of things. Number one, kind of common sense approach and understanding that these conversations have to be had. You cannot be blind to the fact that, particularly with young boys, we've got a crisis here. We've got a crisis that must be dealt with. We must be talking about this. We must be aware of this. But I think it's also about modeling good behavior in the sense that what the problem is not necessarily radical voices that are liberal or conservative. The problem is allowing ourselves to be in those kind of echo chambers, and allowing ourselves as adults to be irresponsible in terms of our own intake and our own rhetoric, and looking at this and saying it's black and white and it's us versus them. I mean, that kind of division, is self-defeating, absolutely, for families, for individuals, for the country. And I think, you have to try to go out of your way to be better informed, because the more informed you are, the less ignorant you are, the more likely you are to be more moderate and be more appreciative. You're going to have less antipathy towards people who are different than you, and less prone to that kind of dangerous division that can lead, to modeling, unfortunately, bad behavior and potentially dangerous behavior. Instead of filling your minds with ideas and your heart with love and acceptance, you're filling your gun closet with weapons for the coming apocalypse. I think, you're modeling the bad behavior. We don't know where the Evergreen shooter got his gun, but it certainly is not easy for a 16-year-old to get a gun, and the laws in Colorado are more strict than that. So I think, we're going to see that there probably was a parental connection there, and we need to follow up, again, reasonable regulations that most Americans overwhelmingly support.
Yeah, I think that that's some really, really good advice, and I do think the love and empathy and trying to see both sides of it. I mean, it's your famous line that you always say, "Whatever you are, be a good one." And I think that parents can model that for their kids, and you've done a very good job of that with me and my siblings. I think that we've grown up to understand lots of different perspectives, and I just, yeah, I think that we need more of that now. But what is the best way for people to support you and your colleagues? I know that there's been so much love and support on social media, and I'm sure that there's been a lot in the Evergreen community right now. What is the best way for everyone to support you guys, especially as you head back into school? What's the best way beyond thoughts and prayers, I guess, that everyone can get involved? What is your recommendation to everyone?
I may be alone in this, or maybe in the minority, but I don't think so. I think, that we were gathered and we see all the mental health support and we see all the outpouring of love in the community. We don't ever doubt that. I think the best way to help us, as teachers, as educators, is to help us do our job. And that is by doing the work that you need to do with your own kids, and doing the work that we need to do in our community and nationally, and getting, politically involved, and fighting against these kind of forces that make our job so much more difficult. The experience of having a radicalized kid, so easily open fire in your school, brings it home to roost, and you realize, look, this is not about the school. It's not about the educational system. It's about us institutionally across the board in the country, and saying, look, we need to do a better job across the board with these kids, with some, again, kind of reasonable regulation. I think most teachers just don't want to feel like they're alone in this fight. That vulnerability is very real, and we want to know that we're being supported in our work. We don't want to be called, all kinds of terrible names, and be, blamed for this and that, which is absolutely absurd. Teachers don't go into this because they don't like kids. Teachers don't go into this to try to radicalize kids to a liberal perspective. We're just trying to help. We're trying to raise kids, and help this country, along the path that we feel very strongly about. And there's very few people that are more patriotic in terms of the life that they lead and the work that they've chosen than teachers. And so I think that would be the message, regardless of your politics. Let's all get in this together. Let's work for these kids, and then by extension, work for our country and our future.
I think that was spot on, and I agree. As the daughter of two public school teachers, I have seen you guys work incredibly hard from the time that I mean, for as long as I can remember, I've seen you guys giving as much as you can to the Evergreen community and the kids that come through your classrooms. And that's not just time in your normal working hours, that's our whole family going and sitting in your classroom over the summers while you lesson planned and prepared for the year. And I think I just want to also extend that perspective of the families of teachers as well, because I've been in touch with a lot of kids of teachers who, also work at your school, Dad. And I think all of us are in a very similar position, but it's just let's look after each other and let's support you guys and make sure that this doesn't happen again. But gosh, if we can stop it from happening in other parts of the country, that's what we need to do because no one should have to feel like this. And it's so frustrating that we have to keep seeing this and just waiting until it's our turn, essentially, which unfortunately was last
Exactly.
week. So yeah, I'm still very frustrated, but I think that this conversation definitely provides that origin of a lot of these issues, but also how we can all do better personally, politically, online, in person, all of it. So I think that this was really, really valuable, Dad. Is there anything that I was missing? Anything else that you want to add?
No, I think it's a good summary, and I appreciate the audience. And all I would add is that we're going to continue the good fight. I'm not going to, I've had some people ask me, "Are you going to retire? Are you going to, is this going to push you out?" No, this is all the more reason of why I do what I do, and I'm not going to, let the current environment or just this one tragic circumstance push me out of the work that I feel so strongly about.
I agree. I absolutely agree. I think that unfortunately, through all of the scary emotions, it's just more affirming to commit to public service and serve others. And it's the same thing with the work that I'm doing with this podcast and Be the Change Media Network in general. Stories can create that empathy that you were talking about. And I think sharing different perspectives and making sure that our voices are all respected and amplified. And it's just important to continue the fight and do that in whatever way makes the most sense to you. But yeah, I think that this was a wonderful conversation to share with everyone. Thank you to everyone who's listening. I'm going to post some more resources to check out. And yeah, you can find those in the description of this episode. But for now, be the change you wish to see in the world. Bye, everyone.